We are a band of brothers, diverse yet unified, aligned to pursue the truth, resolute in our commitment. We are stronger together, and you are one of us.
Gentlemen, for being here this morning. I want to take just a quick second to draw attention to the fact that Johnny started this out of just a hunger to serve the men of Church on the Move. He didn't ask for permission necessarily. No one tapped him on the shoulder and said, "You have to do this." How many ever years ago this whole thing started? 6 years ago. It started in a room across campus with just a couple dozen guys. And look at what God has done, and we're only just getting started. So would you guys help me honor Johnny and the team for putting this together? This year especially, when any of our speakers come, Johnny and Mark and the team get together with the speakers, Whit included, and just say, hey, here's what's going on with the men of Church on the Move, the men of Tulsa, but what do you see? And as I understand it, when they talked to Whit, he said, this year, I think it'd be good just to focus on what does it mean to be a man? What is biblical manhood? So I don't know if you've ever thought about this. Who's the manliest man in the Bible? Who's the manliest man in the Bible? I'll give you just a second to think about that. Who's the manliest man you can think of in the Bible? There's some pretty manly guys. There's a guy by the name of Lamech, who's not necessarily a good guy. In fact, he's not a good guy. Lamech was maybe the first gangster, the first mobster in the Bible. He bragged about killing 70 men. Is he the ideal man in the Bible? Noah was the first craftsman. If you shook his hand, you knew that he was manlier than you. Moses was maybe the greatest leader in the Old Testament. Samson was the strongest man. David, the giant killer, the warrior musician. Solomon, the philosopher and master builder. Of course, none of those guys are who we're talking about. None of those guys are the guys we think about when we talk about a year of biblical manhood. There's one guy, and his name is Jesus. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 tells us that Jesus is the radiance of God's glory and the exact imprint of his nature. Now, in a room this size with guys from disparate backgrounds, we all have a different picture in our mind when we think about Jesus. Maybe you grew up in a church that had pictures of Jesus on stained glass windows, or maybe you saw pictures in the Bible. If you Google images of Jesus, you're going to see this pale, frail-looking guy doing some kind of a curveball thing with his hand. That's not the Jesus that you should think of. Jesus was the manliest man, the most human that ever lived. He could beat you on the golf course. If you don't think of a Jesus who's better at tennis than you, you've got the wrong idea. So why is this important? Why do we hold Jesus so high? Isn't it just an impossible standard to attain to? I mean, we have a hard enough time comparing ourselves or not comparing ourselves to the men around us to measure our own manhood. Why would we hold up this standard and say that's your goal, is to be like Jesus? Well, Romans chapter 8, there's a guy who really took this idea seriously, a guy by the name of Paul. Romans chapter 8, he says this, he says, you have a destiny. I want you to know that. You have a destiny, and that is to be conformed, worked, molded, shaped into the image of Jesus. Now this, in the church world, is what we call spiritual formation. It sounds like kind of a fancy church word, and it is, but let me take 90 seconds just to unpack it just for a second. Jackson, come on up here. This is my son, Jackson. As Johnny mentioned, I've got an almost 13-year-old daughter, Grace. This is my son, Jackson. Jackson, how old are you? How old are you? He said 8th. He said he's 8th. He knows I'm not real happy with how fast he's growing up, so he always says he's in his 8th year of life, just to get me. So Jackson has an outer self, just like you and I do. Jackson also has an inner self, just like you and I do. Jackson's outer self is receiving a form. Now, some of that was wired into him from birth, from the genetic code that was passed down from Ruth and me. But there are any number of other things that are influencing Jackson's outer form. Some things like the kinds of things he puts in his body, the food, the water that he drinks, the kind of man that he is going to be is in part determined by the things he puts inside him. Good or bad, intentional, unintentional, his outer self is receiving a form. But so is his inner self. His inner man is receiving a form. Your inner person is receiving a form. Good or bad, intentional or unintentional, your inner self is receiving a shape and a form. Do you have anything to do with that? Well, the Hebrew word is nephesh. That's the word for soul, and it involves your entire self. Interestingly, the word nephesh also has to do with thirst. Your self, your outer self is thirsty, it's craving. It's like the movie What About Bob? You got to remember the movie What About Bob? Bill Murray, I need. That's what your self is saying all the time, inner self and outer self. So your self is receiving a shape. So it's not a matter of whether or not you're into spiritual formation. You are being shaped. Your spirit is being shaped. Your spirit is receiving a form. What determines that? Well, what determines it is what you give your attention to. What you see about, what you think about when you think about God is what you're moving toward. What you think about when you think about your future self is what you're moving toward, and that's what's shaping you. The people around you determine what's shaping you. Thank you, Jackson. Go have a seat. Give Jackson a big hand. Thanks, Jackson. Big J. So my job title is content pastor. That doesn't mean anything to anybody. When I told my mom, I texted her, hey, I got a new job title as content pastor. And she picked up the phone and called me and she said, man, Stephen, I'm so proud of you. You got a new job now. But just one question. What is a content pastor anyway? Lately, they've been talking about changing our job title to spiritual formation pastor. That looks better on a resume than content pastor. But what is it? What are we after? If you are a pastor, what you're after is helping the people around you become more like Jesus. Whether they are outside of the family of God or inside the family of God, what we think about all day, every day, is how to help you become more like Jesus. How to surround you with the right people, the right information, teach you about the right practice to be shaped into the image of Jesus. By the way, that's what an entire church is for, is to help you become more like Jesus. It's not to hold up some standards so that you can feel guilty about how you're not making it, to make you feel shameful. It's to help you become more like Jesus. So today, for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about something very specific that I think we all deal with. But before we jump into that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank you for the privilege that I have to stand in front of these men who clearly are hungry to become more like you. Help me not to say the things I don't need to say. Help me to say only the things that I need to say. Use my weakness for your strength. May Jesus become real and clear in these next few moments before us. In Jesus' name, amen. About 25 years ago, I was on my way to lunch with a friend. I was running late. I was a student at Oral Roberts University, and if you've ever been on the campus of ORU, you know there's no easy way into or off of that campus. Long, winding, narrow roads with cumbersome speed bumps and students driving old, janky cars going slow because they're, brain and tongues or something. So by the time I get to the edge of 7777 South Lewis Avenue, I'm already late to where I'm going, and I'm a little bit aggravated, a little bit frustrated. I've got a little Honda Prelude, a little 5-speed Honda Prelude. It's not a race car, but I can zip in and out of traffic with that thing. And so I think maybe if I just get to 71st Street, opens up to 4 lanes, I can make up some time. Have you ever had one of those days that it just seemed like the universe was conspiring to keep you late? All of South Tulsa was on 71st Street that afternoon. It seemed like everybody was cutting in front of me, people driving slow in the fast lane. Every traffic light was red, and I get to the traffic light, and you look, and the people at the front of the line aren't even close enough to trip the signal. You know what I'm talking about? My frustration turns to aggravation, and I'm just starting to feel this little thing well up within me. I get to Memorial, and I see a little bit of an opening, so I gun it. And as soon as I do, this 18-wheeler pulls into traffic, cuts off both lanes. I come grinding to a halt as well as everybody behind me. My frustration and aggravation turned to indignation. I was mad. I was angry. I just went from 0 to 9 on an anger scale just like that. I decided to show him that you don't mess with the guy in the Honda Prelude. What am I going to do? What am I going to do to this guy? So here's what I did. I pulled in front of him, and I slowed down to 5 miles per hour. Traffic flying by us on the side. 5 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, 10 miles an hour, 5 miles an hour. He's right on my tail. He's right on my bumper. And I'm just looking in my mirror, looking at him saying, yeah, that's right. I speed off and forget about the whole thing within a matter of moments. I get up to 61st Street, pull into the turning lane, still bumper-to-bumper traffic, median on my left. Guess who didn't forget about what just happened? Here he comes, driving down the far right lane, laying on the horn, window down, flipping me off, cursing me out. And he puts the thing into park. And he walks over with a sledgehammer. He's furious. He's cursing me out at the top of his lungs. With one hand, he's handling that sledgehammer. This is a guy with Noah-type hands. And he's the kind of anger where he's walking slowly and he's just tapping that thing on my windshield, walking over, coming over all across the front of the windshield. Then he gets to my driver's side window, tapping his, cussing me out. I look up at him and I say, "You mad, bro?" Light turns green and I take off. I almost lost my life over being late to lunch. Anger almost works. Anger almost works. Has this been your experience? I don't know about you, but I have a long relationship with anger, a lifetime relationship with anger. I asked Jesus in my heart when I was about 4 years old. I believe that my spirit was regenerated, that I had the life of God inside me. But what does it look like to live a lifetime following Jesus? All my life, I've had real struggles with anger. I like anger. I don't like him coming around all the time, but sometimes when I need a certain kind of thing done, it's just nice to know that I know a guy. I know a guy. Anger is that guy. You don't want him coming around at parties, but you want to know that he's there. And let's be honest, we're talking about manhood. What more could make you feel like a man than the adrenaline rush that comes with being full tilt angry? Makes you feel like a man. About 15 years ago, I was watching College Game Day. My wife was out shopping for groceries. She had a little BMW convertible, old school BMW convertible. She just loved to put the top down and drive around, take her time. I get a phone call from her. "Stephen, somebody hit me at a traffic light, and he's getting away." By the time she finished that sentence, I was already in my car heading that way. Tell me where you are. Tell me where you are. I'm driving down the road as fast as I possibly can, wrong side of the road, running red lights. I finally make it to her, and I didn't go through the process of frustration and aggravation and indignation. I was full tilt rage. By the time I got there, she had tracked down the guy. Her car was scraping the road as she pulled into the parking lot. The guy was drunk or high or something, under some kind of influence, and he's about to go back onto the road and leave. When I see him and I see my wife, Ruth says, "Stephen, he won't pull over." I throw my car into park, I jump out, and I say, "Pull over!" He pulls over. I was kind of surprised. It worked. I don't have a gun. I don't have a knife. I'm not a likes-to-fight guy. But I got that friend in there. You need a friend sometimes. I know a guy. That guy came out. He said, man, I didn't do anything. I said, "I told you to pull over!" He said, "Okay." So he opens the truck. I said, "Sit down on the curb!" He got out and sat out on the curb. And so did the other guy that I didn't even know was in the passenger seat. I walked over to my wife and said, "You okay, baby?" And she looked at me like, "Whoa, baby." Yeah. A couple of moments later, a buddy or a guy who was watching the whole thing came over and he said, "Hey, he's getting up." I said, "I told you to sit down." He said, "I was just getting a cigarette." I said, "You sit down, you get him a cigarette." I promise that's how it went. Anger was my friend. Anger almost worked. Anger almost worked. These guys didn't have any money. It was not a great situation. But can I tell you something? In both of those situations, and countless more, where I allowed my anger to overtake me. Sometimes it was through firing off an email that got me in trouble here at work. Sometimes it was an angry look. Sometimes it was saying things to people that I love that I will always regret. Anytime I've allowed anger to take over, I've always regretted it. In those two instances, once the adrenaline died down, I was in a state of semi-depression for days. Anger almost works, and that's why we keep it up. You need to know this. The hardest habits to give up on are the ones that almost work. The hardest sins to get rid of are the ones that almost work. The hardest temptations to say no to are the ones that almost work. Pornography almost works. It almost works. Adultery almost works. Alcohol almost works. Pick your poison. It almost works. That's why you keep returning to it. Anger is actually a more fundamental problem than any of those things. Dallas Willard said this: anger is the most fundamental problem in your life. Doesn't sound right, doesn't seem right. Where would he get such an idea? Well, the truth is there's not a man in this room that doesn't have some kind of an issue with anger. If I could go through and talk to any of you, go to coffee with any of you individually, I bet you could tell me stories of how anger connects to some of your worst regrets. Some of the worst things you've said, thought, done have been a result of this embodied feeling, these habits surrounding anger. Doesn't seem like the biggest, most important thing, but every job you've ever had, every relationship you've ever been in, everything you wish you hadn't said or done, your buddy anger was there. Anger is maybe the biggest threat to the things you want most in this life, to the man you want to be. You want to be shaped into the image of Jesus? Let's talk about your anger. How do I know? How can Dallas Willard say that anger is the most fundamental problem in your life? Where does he get that idea? Well, systematically, if you talk about systematic theology, which I know you guys are all into, it wouldn't be, of course, sin. Sin is the biggest problem. And after that, pride. But where does anger fall in? Why do we say anger? Well, right after the first sin, in the reality of this new world, what is the first story we get? Any Bible nerds in here? Anybody know? What comes right after the fall? What's the first story? Two brothers in competition with one another. And what's the issue? Well, we don't have the slides for this, so I'll just read it to you. God had regard for Abel's offering, but for Cain's offering, he had no regard. And so what happened? There's this little sting inside of Cain's mind. He feels it in his body. He looks at his brother. He sees how God is treating him. He sees the place that his brother has. And his first reaction, body, mind, soul, is anger. It says, so Cain wasn't just angry. He's full tilt angry. He's very angry. It says his face fell. And so God said to Cain, you mad, bro? He says, why are you angry? Why is your face fallen? Listen to what he says. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Cain, there's an opportunity with every anger. In fact, there's something that happens when anger presents itself that is a signal to us that something is wrong, right? If you feel pain in your body, it's a signal that something is wrong. Pay attention to it. Jesus, in launching and founding this community of redemption, in the founding documents called the Sermon on the Mount, he deals with this issue. After he teaches his disciples how to pray, talks about a few other things, he starts talking about anger. Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, you've heard that it was said to people long ago, you shall not murder. Cain murdered. You're supposed to be thinking, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. Well, it's easy to get behind that. Who wouldn't agree to that? Anybody who murders would be subject to judgment. Then Jesus says this, but I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will also be subject to judgment. Anyone who says to his brother or sister, racha, is answerable in court. Now that word, that Hebrew word racha, there's not an English translation for it, so they just left it in the Aramaic or Hebrew, and it's an onomatopoeia, like it's a word made after a sound. Racha, what does that sound like? Years ago, you will not remember this, but we were playing football, flag football. We did this all the time back in the day. In our 20s, you got nothing but time, and so we would play flag football, we play basketball, play all the stuff. But we're playing football out here at this practice field, and I'm on Whit's team. And this is pre-real Jesus Whit, so please forgive me for embarrassing you. I'm on his team, and we're getting thumped. And man, the more we get, I mean, if you know anything about Whit, you know he doesn't like to lose, and neither do I. I mean, who does, right? So, but we're losing, we're getting thumped, and so Whit's man actually gets beat on a route. I mean, Whit actually gets beat on a route. Whit's guarding this guy, he gets beat, but I'm the safety. Well, I'm on the other side of the field, and he gets behind me too, catches a touchdown. Whit looks at me and says, how did you let him get behind you? I'm angry. I'm really angry at him. But I don't want to lose my job. So I just looked at him right in the eye and I said, that's raka. That's what that is. And guess who's subject to judgment for that? Again, anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. How many times have you called somebody an idiot? Maybe you did on the way to breakfast this morning, called somebody an idiot. Now think about what Jesus is saying. Think about the standard he's holding out. He goes on to say that this is such an important thing that if you're in an argument, in a riff, if you're mad at somebody and you're holding a grudge against somebody, don't even bother trying to honor God with your generosity. Don't even come to church. Go take care of the thing first, he says. He said, you've heard it said, eye for an eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek also. Now, we've heard these words before. But how many of you have taken them seriously? I'll be honest with you. When I read these words, even preparing for this, I look at these words and I'm kind of astounded at the lack of seriousness with which I've taken these words. I can't believe, and the truth is, even now, I have a really hard time believing that that's true. Because that's not the way the world works, Jesus. Anger you're supposed to just channel your anger, right? Or maybe you're supposed to be a stoic and just kind of stiff arm your anger and just tell yourself it doesn't bother you. What is Jesus actually saying? If anybody slaps you on the cheek, turn the other cheek. We say a nonviolent life seems like, maybe someday when Jesus comes back to rule and reign. But here in this life, before Jesus comes, you got to take things into your own hands sometimes. That's what a man does, right? But remember, you have a destiny. And that destiny is to be shaped into the image of Jesus. How is that possible? How is it possible to become more like Jesus in this area? What are we supposed to do? Well, there's a one-word answer to that the writers of the New Testament came up with, and that word is patience. James, the brother of Jesus, said this. He said, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing, when you get tested, when you're feeling testy, the testing of your faith produces something. What does it produce? Well, it shapes you. It molds you. It forms you. It forms your inner man. Who do you look like in the test? If you absorb the complication, absorb the pain, what does it make you look like? Well, it makes you look like Jesus. And the word, he says, the thing that it produces is patience. And he says, but let patience have its perfecting work. Let patience perfect you, shape you, mold you, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, he says, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. When I first started working at Church on the Move, I thought the best job I could have would just be to be a pastor. I couldn't imagine. I came from South Georgia, rural South Georgia. I think my dad's church at most had maybe 50 people. He, in fact, had to string together 4 different churches just to pay his $28,000 salary. I got a job as a pastor. And very soon after, I heard some people the next level above me talking about, you know what, maybe you have department head in your future. Maybe you could be a department head. And I started putting that as the image of my future in front of me. I didn't get it 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, 5 different times for ordinary, understandable reasons. If you saw the people who got it, you'd say, yeah, Stephen, that's probably right. But you better believe a seed of bitterness and anger grew within me. a couple of different times, the boss that I was working for took over another department and said, I'm going to go to that department and give you this one. I'm going to recommend you have this one. The second time that happened, the person came back to the department and said, I'm sorry, I gave the other department away instead of this one. See, I mean, right now, it seems so small. It seems so small. Things have happened to you far worse than that. But can I tell you, that was the thing that made me give up? That was the thing that let this low-grade anger well up within me. And I just said, forget about it. I'm going to keep this job, and who knows what kind of damage is going to happen next. Within a few months, I found myself in an affair with someone on my staff. By the grace of God, I got caught. And God, over the course of the next couple of years, totally redeemed my life. He reached in. He inclined my heart to Him, and not towards selfish gain. In that season, you know what I had to learn? Patience. In that season, they said, Stephen, 2 years, no ministry. I said, I'm not going back into ministry, but just within 18 months, I knew I'm supposed to be heading back. I don't know, I mean, church on the move is impossible, but maybe somewhere, some way, someone's going to take me as a pastor. And so I came to Ruth, and I said, babe, you're not going to want to hear this, but I think I'm supposed to be a pastor again. And she said, I do not see it. I said, well, I'm not telling you I'm going to go out and search for a job to be a pastor. What I'm telling you that if it takes 5 years, 10 years, the rest of my life, I'm going to be the kind of man who could be. And that requires patience. You're not going to, don't just listen to what I say. I want you to watch. If you see me living in such a way that doesn't seem like it lines up with that kind of man, a man who's more like Jesus, would you tell me? About that time, I started going to the mountains with some dear friends. And as I did, every mountain trip, I'm learning how to deal with anger through patience. Jesus said, you can become more like Him. James said, you can become more like Jesus. Paul said, you can become more like Jesus. And the way to do that is through this thing called patience. Now, one quick thing about how this works. At the core of your being is your will. Your will, your heart, your spirit, your will, all kind of represent the same thing. The next outer ring is your feelings. It's your thoughts. And the next outer ring from that is your body. And then I mentioned at the front of the talk, the next outer ring from that is your soul, the Hebrew word nephesh. It's all of you. How do you change to become more like Jesus? Well, it's different than any self-help thing you'll ever read. It's different than what you might think. It does not start simply by having enough willpower. There's some studies that show that willpower is not like a tool. It's not like an engine. You can't just turn it on. It's more like a muscle. They did a study where two groups of people had to solve this problem that they didn't know was impossible to solve. And the whole experiment was just to see which group of people was going to last the longest. One of those groups of people had another experiment right before that where all they had to do was the famous cookie experiment, and they just had to resist cookies for a little bit of time. Who do you think lasted longer in the experiment, in the second experiment? The people who did not have to resist in the first place. Why? You have a limited amount of willpower. You have a limited amount of willpower. You use your willpower to make choices. Where are we going to go out to eat tonight, baby? I don't know. You're exhausted just making the choice. You have a limited amount of willpower resisting temptation. You have a limited amount of willpower with presentation management. You go for a job interview. You have a limited amount of willpower. But you know what your willpower can do inexhaustively and never get tired? There's one thing your will can do without ever getting tired. It's what your will was created to do. Anybody know? Surrender. 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 You can surrender all day, every day. On your way to work here in just a couple of minutes, something might happen. You're going to get a text message, an email, a phone call. Somebody's going to rub you the wrong way, and you're going to be angry. Being angry is just you're not getting your way. Anything that happens to where you don't get your way is an opportunity to get angry. And when you don't get your way, you can begin to practice patience. How do you practice patience? Simply by surrendering. There's a really simple prayer. A really simple prayer. It's a breathe in, breathe out prayer. It goes like this. I can't. Jesus, you can. Or maybe you just say, Jesus, help. Or you might just say, I'm here. You're here. Practice the presence of Jesus and you're practicing patience. What's going to happen? Well, that willpower is going to start to outsource your decisions, right? What you practice becomes a habit. You know what your willpower is terrible at? Your willpower is terrible at overcoming your deeply embedded habits. But if you keep at it, you keep practicing, you keep practicing, you keep practicing patience, someday you're going to be in that situation where that friend of yours wants to come out. That rage friend wants to come out. And guess what's going to happen? The person and the image of Jesus is going to come out instead. Do you know Jesus himself did this? Jesus himself took his will to God. In the Garden of Gethsemane, just before he's going to the cross, he knows what he's there for. His whole life has been leading up to this, and what does Jesus do? He takes his will to the Father. By the way, first of all, he processes his emotions with his friends, and then he processes his emotions with God. He processes his emotions in a safe place, and then he processes his emotions with his Father. You think he's just going through the motions when he says, Father, not my will, but yours be done? When he says, take this cup from me, do you think he's just going through the motions? Do you think that's just there so that we have a nice set of words to look at? He really is struggling with this. He really has the opportunity to be angry. But he, by the way, has spent a lifetime of only doing what he saw the Father doing. You want to know the most incredible feat of human history? It's what Jesus went through in those 24 hours. He surrendered his will to the Father. You know what happened next? An angry mob shows up. Torches, an accusation, an angry kiss, and Jesus is betrayed. Jesus is brought before an angry tribunal. Angry jurors are bearing false witness against Jesus. Does he stand up and defend himself? An angry governor presides over the judgment, the final judgment of Jesus, and an angry mob says, crucify him. Then there's Jesus hung there after angry soldiers with violent weapons put him up on display for the whole world to see, naked, accused, falsely accused, shamefully, woefully, cursedly accused. He hung there, surrendered, and anger almost worked. The greatest display of anger the world has ever seen almost worked. It took down the very Son of God. Anger almost worked. But surrender never fails. Because patience never fails. Because love never fails. Do you want to become the kind of person Jesus called you to be, the kind of leader Jesus called you to be? You can become more like Jesus, and it's as simple today, over the next few weeks, at looking at your anger and saying, God, how can I surrender that to you?